Hello, Flat Earth researchers, debaters and debunkers. We are told that debate raged for centuries over the size and shape of the Earth and where it is in the universe and how everything in the universe actually works. And we are told that all these arguments were put to bed by the advancement of science and astronomy and a few brilliant minds that eventually concluded that we live on a spinning sphere orbiting the Sun in a heliocentric solar system. So when people come across today's investigations and discussions into flat Earth or attempts to debunk the globe, they assume that we have people either of an extreme Christian belief or people wanting to ignore the entire body of science and take us back to the Stone Age, and that they're just too stupid to understand or get educated about physics. But this is not the case. I'm going to highlight the dichotomy that we have been taught in our current understanding of the historical events that led up to our current understanding or model of the Earth and the universe by looking at what we're told by Stephen Hawking in A Brief History of Time, and to try and build some awareness that people looking into the flat Earth now or still questioning the scientific theories that have led to the current belief that we live on a spinning ball are looking into the possibility that we're on something stationary and much larger than we have previously been led to believe. And these are new ways of looking at what has previously been assumed, and also demanding real scientific investigation, measurable, demonstrable proof of what we are told is our Earth and our place in the universe. So I'm just going to highlight a few paragraphs in this book, A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. It's not cherry picking. I urge anyone to just go and get a copy or download it. You can do it for free. I'll put a link in the description so you can just go and read it. But it's important to point out how we have been just given basically two very basic arguments when really we are in a universe of infinite possibilities. And of course it does come down to the ideas of creation and is there a start and an end to time, etc. This is all stuff that people can consider on their own, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of paragraphs in these introductory pages which should illustrate how assumptions and conclusions have been made that are not necessarily scientific and have not considered many other aspects of the observations we can and do make in scientific investigation of what this place actually is. So let's just jump right into it here with this one here. In fact, we'll go right to the top here, chapter 1. So what we told this story that Bertrand Russell once gave a public lecture on astronomy. He described how the Earth orbits around the Sun and how the Sun in turn orbits around the center of a vast collection of stars called our galaxy. At the end of the lecture, a little old lady at the back of the room got up and said, "What you have told us is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant tortoise." The scientist gave a superior smile before replying, "What is the tortoise standing on?" "You're a very clever young man, very clever," said the old lady, "but it's turtles all the way down." Okay, so this is the story we are given. This is the two sides of the argument, really. We've got on one hand someone telling us that we're on a sphere orbiting the Sun, and the argument against that is that we're on a disk or a flat plate supported by tortoises. So, of course, the argument against what is the science of the day does appear to be something ridiculous, and this is what people think of when it comes to the picture that comes up in our mind when we hear about flat Earth. We're given this. On the one hand, we have science, and then on the other hand, we have this ridiculous old woman who had a ridiculous idea about the Earth being on a turtle. So it goes on. Most people would find the picture of our universe as an infinite tower of tortoises rather ridiculous. But why do we think we know better? What do we know about the universe, and how do we know it? Where did the universe come from, and where is it going? Did the universe have a beginning, and if so, what happened before then? What is the nature of time? Will it ever come to an end? Can we go back in time? Recent breakthroughs in physics, made possible in part by fantastic new technologies, suggest answers to some of these long-standing questions. Someday these answers may seem as obvious to us as the Earth orbiting the Sun, or perhaps as ridiculous as a tower of tortoises. Only time, whatever that may be, will tell. Okay, but let's go on to this first paragraph I'd like to highlight here, which really shows how we've been very restricted in the two sides, or the so-called proofs that we've been given that we live on a globe. So as long ago as 340 BC, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his book On the Heavens, was able to put forward two good arguments for believing that the Earth was a round sphere rather than a hat plate. So again, just to point out that what we are given here is just two opposing arguments. One, that the Earth is a sphere, and the other, that it's a plate somewhere in space. First, he realized that eclipses of the moon were caused by the Earth coming between the Sun and the moon. Of course, we do hear this a lot as one of the so-called fundamental proofs that we're on a sphere. Now, if you look into it, then you'll see that lunar eclipses often occur with both the Sun and the moon still above the horizon. So it's not necessarily a given or any kind of proof that the Earth is between the Sun and the moon. And then we have this other argument that the Earth's shadow of the moon was always round, which, so again, it's assuming that it's the Earth casting the shadow, and because this so-called shadow is round, then that dictates the shape of the Earth. Okay, so it's a couple of assumptions all wrapped into one as the fundamental proof that we're on a spherical Earth, which would be true only if the Earth was spherical. If the Earth had been a flat disk, the shadow would have been elongated and elliptical, unless the eclipse always occurred at a time when the Sun was directly under the center of the disk. Okay, so again, it's really focusing on one or the other, a sphere or a disk, and the assumption that what's causing the darkness on the moon is, without a doubt, the shadow of the Earth. So that's the first kind of so-called proof of a globe Earth. Second, the Greeks knew from their travels that the North Star appeared lower in the sky when viewed in the south than it did in more northerly regions. Since the North Star lies over the North Pole, it appears to be directly above an observer at the North Pole, but to someone looking from the equator, it appears to lie just at the horizon. Okay, so again, we get this over and over and over again, this same old argument and assumption that the North Star is above the North Pole. Now, first of all, I've personally never seen a picture of the Polaris directly above an observer said to be at the North Pole. So there's one assumption that hasn't been necessarily proven. And then we have the assumption that just because Polaris appears to get lower in the sky as we get further away, it means we're on a sphere. Now, of course, we have the issue of perspective, a very real-life observation that is repeatable, that anyone can make with anything that is above the Earth. The further away you get from it, the closer it will appear to be towards the horizon. But here, it's not talked about, it's not considered as a part of the argument, it's just assumed that this means that we're on a spherical Earth. So that's the second argument made from observations looking in the sky. We've got an apparent shadow of the sun, or the Earth on the moon, and the observation that the North Star or Polaris gets closer to the horizon as we get further away from it. That's two so-called proofs for the globe, which are merely choice interpretations and assumptions right from the start that do have alternative explanations. And where do we go from here? From the difference in the apparent position of the North Star in Egypt and Greece, Aristotle even quoted an estimate that the distance around the Earth was 400,000 stadia. It is not known exactly what length a stadium was, but it may have been about 200 yards, which would make Aristotle's estimate about twice the currently accepted figure. So even if this was an estimate made by looking at the stars, what we have is something that actually turned out to be twice as large as what we are given as our currently accepted figure. The Greeks even had a third argument that the Earth must be round, for why else does one see the sails of a ship coming over the horizon and only later see the hull? Okay, so this is what we are historically taught as the three fundamental proofs that we are on a globe, each of which has a perfectly acceptable alternative and repeatable, demonstrable observation that can be made. The sails of ships coming over the horizon is just something to do with all sorts of things, such as perspective and the conditions. And if we're just looking from a low viewpoint across water, then this is what happens. The surface of the water will cut off objects beyond it. And we've got refraction and we've got compression and all kinds of other things that contribute to this. And of course, modern day observations, of course with the addition of being able to get much higher than we could all those years ago, allow us to see much, much further than we should be able to. And we can zoom in on ships and we can see that they do not always disappear hull first, or do not always come towards us from with the sails up above the surface. And it's just not an argument for a globe Earth that is any kind of solid proof, none whatsoever. In fact, anyone who looks at horizons will realize that horizons are not curvature. It's simply perspective and other conditions. It's the way light behaves. All sorts of factors come into it. But here are the three fundamental arguments that we are told, and we hear again and again and again when it comes to discussing the so-called proofs for being on a globe. So I'd say they have been debunked over and over again, certainly not as proofs, and can't even be counted as evidence, because there are most definitely very good alternative, not only explanations but demonstrations that can be made. People can see further than we should be able to. End of story. So there's some more explanations there. Here's one of the models that was promoted. Okay, so let's just go down again. I'm not cherry picking. This, of course, can be downloaded. Anyone can look at this and pick through it and make up their own mind. But this is what I see. So then we come along to Sir Isaac Newton in 1687, who published his Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, probably the most important single work ever published in the physical sciences. Okay, so he's put on a pedestal there. In it, Newton not only put forward a theory of how bodies move in space and time, but he also developed the complicated mathematics needed to analyze those motions. In addition, Newton postulated a law of universal gravitation, according to which each body in the universe was attracted towards every other body by a force that was stronger the more massive the bodies and the closer they were to each other. It was this same force that caused objects to fall to the ground. Now, this last sentence is very, very important and significant. Basically, it's trying to make this connection to dropping something on the earth, a dense object, an object that has mass, dropping it through the air and assuming that there is some kind of force doing this other than the object's mass in a less dense medium that is connected to everything going on in the sky. Observing lights in the sky, assuming that they have mass, and it's this mass that is the driving force of the whole entire mechanics of the universe, simply because you can drop something and it falls to the ground. To be frank, this is actually, it doesn't matter how complicated, of course you make some complicated mathematics, but it's a very simple attempt to connect earthbound physics to whatever's happening up in this, ignoring electromagnetism, ignoring frequencies, ignoring the fact that there is no way of telling that those bodies of celestial objects of light are anything other than what we see them as. But of course, they were able to make calculations based on time. Again, this whole thing is called a brief history of time. So these people were measuring the passage of time, or the time it takes for objects in the sky to orbit each other, and assuming that this force is the same as what's happening on the Earth, just because you drop something through the air. That's it. That is the crux of the connection. Trying to make a connection between what happens on the earth to what's happening in the sky, and saying it's all the same thing. And this has been institutionalized over the years, and Newton put on a pedestal for doing so. So, on we go. Another argument was put forward by St Augustine in his book, The City of God. He pointed out that civilization is progressing, and we remember who performed this deed or developed that technique. Thus, man, and so also perhaps the universe, could not have been around all that long. St Augustine accepted a date of about 5000 BC for the creation of the universe, according to the book of Genesis. It is interesting that this is not so far from the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 BC, which is when archaeologists tell us that civilization really began. Okay, so we have this kind of linear thing. This is where the whole idea of evolution and cavemen and everything comes from, and so we somehow reached this pinnacle of intelligence through evolution. But this is a very interesting point that we have next. Aristotle and most of the other Greek philosophers, on the other hand, did not like the idea of a creation because it smacked too much of divine intervention. They believed, therefore, that the human race and the world around it had existed and would exist forever. The ancients had already considered the argument about progress described above, and answered it by saying that there had been periodic floods or other disasters that repeatedly set the human race right back to the beginning of civilization. Okay, so there's another argument that seems to have a lot of evidence with what people are looking into these days, the reset, as it were, whether it's mud floods or earthquakes, whatever, disasters, catastrophes that reset humanity. Okay, so it's a very valid argument when you look at some of the people that are making some very valid points and doing some very good investigation into ancient civilizations and the very real possibility and what seems to be very good evidence that technology existed in a time before we know. Yeah? And let's just, not much longer, I'm going to keep this very, very brief, okay? So here we go, another paragraph. Any physical theory is always provisional. in the sense that it is only a hypothesis. You can never prove it. No matter how many times the results of experiments agree with some theory, you can never be sure that the next time the result will not contradict the theory. On the other hand, you can disprove a theory by finding even a single observation that disagrees with the predictions of the theory. Now, it's been observed many, many times by many, many independent researchers that we can see further than we should be able to if we live on a globe. So, given that, the globe should go out of the window. That's it. Done. As philosopher of science Karl Popper has emphasized, a good theory is characterized by the fact that it makes a number of predictions that could in principle be disproved or falsified by observation. Each time new experiments are observed to agree with the predictions, the theory survives, and our confidence in it is increased. But if ever a new observation is found to disagree, we have to abandon or modify the theory. So again, people have found that we can, with modern technology, see further than we should. The whole thing about ships disappearing over the horizon has been debunked many, many times. So this, if people are going to be scientific about it, we should abandon the globe Earth theory, because it has been disproven. So, last bit here. The eventual goal of science is to provide a single theory that describes the whole universe. This is part of the problem. Everyone's trying to come up with a single answer for everything. However, the approach most scientists actually follow is to separate the problem into two parts. First, there are the laws that tell us how the universe changes with time. If we know what the universe is like at any one time, these physical laws tell us how it will look at any later time. Second, there is the question of the initial state of the universe. Some people feel that science should be concerned with only the first part. They regard the question of the initial situation as a matter for metaphysics or religion. So yes, we are talking about creation. And of course, so this attempt by the scientific community to talk about the creation in a Big Bang, etc., expanding universe, is a religious ideology, yeah? Because science is, as it's pointed out here, should be the observation of what is happening now. Yes, you can make certain predictions, but you can't make any kind of assumptions or conclusions about what happened millions and millions of years ago, yeah? And here we have, it turns out to be very difficult to devise a theory to describe the universe all in one go. Absolutely, because again, just to go back to this one, what we do have is all this compartmentalized science. So when you talk about spin, or you talk about curvature, or Coriolis, or whatever it might be, people come back with these very compartmentalized arguments. But of course, what we're trying to do ultimately, as it's pointed out, is trying to come up with something that covers everything, which may well be impossible. But the problem we have is people make very compartmentalized observations or assumptions, or these different bits and pieces of the so-called model are compartmentalized, and they do not fit together as a whole. And this is what Hawking is telling us straight off, that this is a problem, that everything is separated. So it turns out to be very difficult to devise a theory to describe the universe all in one go. Instead, we break the problem up into bits and invent a number of partial theories. Each of these partial theories describes and predicts a certain limited class of observations, neglecting the effects of other quantities or representing them by simple sets of numbers. It may be that this approach is completely wrong. Okay, so he's being honest and transparent, and this is what the scientific method should be realizing and should be taking into account, that everything has been compartmentalized, partial theories, limited class of observations, neglecting the effects of other quantities or representing them by simple sets of numbers. This is what we are confronted with as the so-called proofs for the globe. And this is the difference between the globe earth defenders and flat earth researchers or globe deniers, however you want to label them. Okay, you have the globe defenders who insist on sticking to their compartmentalized arguments, whereas someone who's really thinking about this properly is trying to put them all together into a unified model. And it is then when you really examine and study what we have been told are these compartmentalized proofs for the globe that you realize that they do not fit together. So that the time is right to be looking at trying to, or at least admitting that things, all these compartmentalized ideas and theories do not work as a solid model. So anyone who claims that we have a working model is lying, because even the scientific community and Stephen Hawking admits that we do not have a unified theory. So it may be that this approach is completely wrong. If everything in the universe depends on everything else in a fundamental way, it might be impossible to get close to a full solution by investigating parts of the problem in isolation. Nevertheless, it is certainly the way that we have made progress in the past. The classic example again is the Newtonian theory of gravity, which tells us that the gravitational force between two bodies depends only on one number associated with each body, its mass, but is otherwise independent of what the bodies are made of. Thus, one does not need to have a theory of the structure and constitution of the Sun and the planets in order to calculate their orbits. Okay, so really, it's just, yeah, I think hopefully this brief introduction and these highlighted paragraphs will allow people with real discernment and the ability to think critically should see that people who deny the globe for all the reasons that we've highlighted have every right to do so. No one should be complaining about people questioning the pseudoscience that has been cobbled together to have us believe that we're on a spinning globe orbiting the sun. It could all be wrong, and I'd say it is all wrong. And again, the research, the arguments, the thinking, the ideas that are going into flat Earth research now are new and different to the old arguments that were used and allegedly killed or put to bed a long time ago. Okay? I do hope this is food for thought and at least brings some kind of bridge of understanding between those who wish to fight the flat Earth, because actually, as I said, and the scientific community says, and Stephen Hawking said, we have every right to do so. Thank you very much.